The question is that the bill now be read a second time. I call the Parliamentary Secretary and the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to speak on the Corporations Amendment Streamlining of Future of Financial Advice Bill 2014. And in the brief time available to me, I'd like to make 3 points. The first is that the set of stronger legislative provisions for Australians, protections for Australians obtaining financial advice, which were introduced under the last government, are broadly supported by the Coalition. And we made that clear at the time, and that continues to be in our position. Having said that, Labor's Future of Financial Advice legislation nevertheless contains some troubling instances of legislative overreach where the costs of the measure, the social costs, exceeded the benefits. And indeed, in some cases, the consequence was that financial advice became less readily available than it had previously been. And therefore, the third point I make, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the Coalition took to the last election a promise to make some amendments to the Future of Financial Advice legislation to get the balance right in this critical area so as to protect consumers and to ensure the greatest possible availability of financial advice. So let me turn to the first point, the broad support of the Coalition for the reform direction that was pursued under the previous government. And as the previous speaker, the member for Kingsford Smith, pointed out, the genesis of these measures goes back to an inquiry conducted by the Corporations and Financial Services Committee following the collapse of Storm Financial, which occurred as one of the many consequences of the global financial crisis, when there was a very sharp drop in equities prices, and it emerged that a significant number of Australians, many of them not financially sophisticated, had been put into pretty risky schemes under which they mortgaged their homes to buy a portfolio of shares. The share market fell sharply, the value of the share portfolios fell, and many Australians, many of them not financially sophisticated, ended up in a very difficult position as a result. Now, the key recommendation of that inquiry, known as the Ripoll inquiry, that inquiry of the Corporations and Financial Services Committee, was to impose a fiduciary duty on financial advisors, requiring them to place the interests of their clients ahead of their own. And of course, the Coalition clearly supports that principle. Now, I do want to highlight one observation made in the final report of the Ripoll inquiry, where it was specifically noted that it was not an absence of regulation that was the problem, it was an absence of enforcement. Quotes, "The committee is of the general view that situations where investors lose their entire savings because of poor financial advice are more often a problem of enforcing existing regulations rather than being due to regulatory inadequacy. Where financial advisors are operating outside regulatory parameters, the consequences of those actions should not necessarily be attributed to the content of the regulations." Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, somewhere along the line that principle got lost, and the FOFA measures built around some sensible core principles and a significant encrustation of excessive regulatory burden and counterproductive regulatory burden. Mr Deputy Speaker, there were measures contained within the FOFA legislation which imposed social costs which exceeded the social benefit. Let me mention, for example, the retrospective fee disclosure requirement. Many products currently in the market are 10, 15 or more years old, and the retrospective fee disclosure requirement means that major financial services providers were required to open up and make major changes to their legacy IT systems which support those products. Such an exercise is always risky, expensive and deeply fraught. Indeed, the Financial Services Council estimated that its members would incur around $1.5 billion in cost in implementing these changes in the area of superannuation advice and insurance reforms. And I do want to make an important related point here, Mr Deputy Speaker. One of the evils which the Future of Financial Advice legislation was designed to address, purportedly, was advisors who were, in substance, salespeople employed by banks or other product manufacturers as opposed to independent providers of advice. But one of the perverse consequences of the future of financial advice legislation has been that some of its provisions have in fact made the business model of genuinely independent advisors harder to sustain than before. For example, the requirement to provide a single annual fee statement can be more difficult to meet for an independent financial advisor who might, for example, have put his or her clients into a range of products from a range of different product manufacturers, to use the industry jargon. And it might be more difficult to do that than for somebody who is tied to a particular product manufacturer and puts all of his or her clients into the products of that particular manufacturer. And similarly, the opt-in requirement creates difficulties for independent advisors competing against larger organisations with huge sales and marketing budgets. So I make the point, Mr Deputy Speaker, that it's one thing to talk about the objectives of legislation, it's another thing to carefully analyse the actual effects on a market, on both providers and on consumers, of those provisions. And in the detailed analysis that the Coalition did in relation to the measures in the Future of Financial Advice package, there were a number of instances of measures that we thought, in substance, in fact, worsened the position from the point of view of the desirability of making financial advice as broadly available as possible, so that Australians who are called upon to make significant financial decisions in relation to such matters as insurance, superannuation, should I pay down my mortgage, should I put more money into an equity fund or into bonds, all of these questions that many of us are called upon to wrestle with as we seek to plan for our retirement. It's important that there be the widest possible availability of financial advice and affordable financial advice. And one of the principles which guided the Coalition as we looked at the measures in the legislative package was which ones advance the position towards achieving that desirable objective and which ones actually end up causing that position to be harder to achieve. The opt-in requirement, which I mentioned briefly before, is a requirement under which every financial advisor is compelled to obtain written confirmation from a client every second year that the client still wishes to retain that advisor. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's worth making the point that the opt-in requirement was dreamt up by the Industry Super Network, which is the lobby group for industry superannuation funds, and you can see why they like that measure. It makes very little difference to the business model of the industry funds while doing a pretty effective job of disrupting the business model used by retail funds, in which financial advisors play an important role. Now, it no doubt did no harm at all to the Industry Super Network's prospects of getting a hearing on the desirability of introducing this opt-in requirement that the Minister for Financial Services and Superannuation at the time was our friend, the member for Maribyrnong, now the Leader of the Opposition, and he, of course, is a former director of a predecessor organisation of the biggest of the industry super funds, Australian Super. So again, I make the point, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there were a range of motivations swirling around, and a number of the provisions which ended up in the legislation were not necessarily motivated exclusively by a desire to protect Australian consumers. There may well have been other motivations which were also in the mind of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd Labor government in introducing those measures. Another area which falls under that, of which the same analysis could be made, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the future financial advice provisions had the effect of making it more difficult for financial advisors to deliver what is known as scaled advice. Now, scaled advice is another one of the jargon terms that pervades this area, but it refers to the provision of advice which is limited in scope to some extent. For example, advice on superannuation products rather than on a holistic financial plan. Now, feedback from the industry is that the current legislative provisions have resulted in increased costs and in significant legal uncertainty for advisors who do not feel that it truly allows them to provide scaled advice to their clients. In other words, the provisions as they presently operate may require an advisor to investigate all of the client's financial services, even when advice is sought on a specific and narrow issue. The consequence of that, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that Australians who seek financial advice on a specific and defined issue, in fact, may find it harder to get that advice because there's a set of legislative provisions which now make it more difficult for advisors to deliver that advice. And if you say that the policy objective is to maximise the availability of financial advice to Australians who need that, whether that be broad-ranging advice addressing the totality of their life and financial circumstances, or whether that be more narrowly defined financial advice, scaled financial advice, then we believe that some of the settings in the current legislation need revising. That's why, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I turn to the third part of what I want to say today, this bill gives effect to a commitment made by the Coalition at the last election that we would make some changes to get the balance right. The Corporations and Financial Services Committee in the last parliament, of which I was a member, contained a number of Coalition members and senators, and we issued a minority report with 16 recommendations and went to the 2013 election with commitments based upon those recommendations. We committed that we would remove the opt-in arrangements, that we would bring about the simplification and streamlining of the additional annual fee disclosure requirements, we would improve the operation of the best interest duty, and we would provide certainty around the provision and availability of scaled advice. I want to comment particularly, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the question of the best interest duty, because we've heard from speakers from the other side of the House that we, in some way, in the measures in this bill, are gutting the best interest duty contained in the legislation. Nothing could be further from the truth, as the most cursory examination of the legislative provisions makes clear. The first point I highlight is that the requirement for a financial advisor to act in the best interest of his or her client is set out in subsection 961B(1) of the Corporations Act, and there is no change to that provision contained in the bill before the House this afternoon. The second point I make is that subsection 961B(2) outlines the steps that an advisor may go through to show that he or she has satisfied the duty to act in the best interests of his or her client, and there are 6 steps that are in the legislation now and that will remain in the legislation after this bill goes through. The first is a requirement to identify the subject matter of the advice sought and the objectives, financial situation and needs of the client. I'm paraphrasing and simplifying somewhat. Secondly, to identify the objectives, financial situation and needs of the client that are disclosed to the advisor. Thirdly, where it was reasonably apparent that information relating to the client's relevant circumstances was incomplete or inaccurate, to make reasonable inquiries to obtain complete and accurate information. Fourthly, the fourth step for the advisor to take is to assess whether the advisor has the expertise required to provide the client advice on the subject matter sought. The fifth step is if, in considering the subject matter of the advice sought, it would be reasonable to consider recommending a financial product, first to conduct a reasonable investigation into the financial product that might achieve those of the objectives and meet those of the needs of the client that would reasonably be considered as relevant to advice on that subject matter, and secondly, to assess the information gathered in the investigation. And the sixth step is to base all judgments in advising the client on the client's relevant circumstances. A very comprehensive set of steps which, if a financial advisor goes through, then both the advisor and the client have certainty about the best interest duty being met. There is only one provision which we are removing from the Act in this bill, and that is a catch-all requirement that, as well as all of the steps I've gone through, an advisor must take any other reasonable step that would be regarded as being in the best interest of the client, given the client's relevant circumstances. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is an inherently uncertain provision. It is quite unclear what it means. It is quite unclear what obligation it imposes on a financial advisor, and it is to remove that uncertainty that we are making that narrow technical amendment to remove that provision. but the vast substance of this regime remains in place. There are specific targeted amendments in this bill to cause the regime to operate more efficiently, and I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the Parliamentary Secretary. The question is that this bill